This screencast on the nouns is going to be much shorter than the previous screencast on verbs because there's not nearly as much to show and to learn about the noun system. I don't have a special workspace file, so just go ahead and start up Accordance. And I think we can just get rid of the right-hand zone with the tools and make the English text just a little bit larger. Let's go ahead and look up the uses of logos. So we need to switch to a words search. And we'll search for logos, Logos. And let's limit the search to just Mark. Come to think of it, if you don't have the search range for Mark, we can do it another way. We can just go back to logos and say Command-Shift-A for the and then Command-Shift-R for range, and then type in Mark and do the search. This gets us all the examples of logos in the Gospel of Mark. I want to go to Mark 4:15, so what you can do is hit your tab until the go-to box is highlighted, and you can type in Mark 4:15, and this just goes to that reference in the current search text. And there we have the passage. This is the interpretation of the parable of the sower. And so you can see that it's saying, these are those alongside the way where is sown the word. Where the word is sown. In other words, so here logos is the subject of the verb spiritai. And so it has to go into the nominative case. And if you do a mouse over on logos and go down to instant details, you'll see that it is in fact nominative. How do they make logos nominative? Well, they have the basic stem, which is loga, and they put the appropriate nominative case ending, in this case a nominative singular case ending, which is sigma. And so logos is nominative singular. But you go down to the second half of the verse, to ire, and carries off the word. In this case, logon is functioning as the direct object of ire, and so it has to be in the accusative case. So they stick the appropriate accusative singular case ending onto the stem, which is a nu, and you have logon, direct object of ire. So there's a nominative and an accusative. Now I want to find just the dative forms of logos. So go ahead and click right after the final sigma, type an @ sign, and then go up to search, enter tag, noun. Choose the dative case, click OK, and do your search. I haven't said anything yet about prepositions in the Greek primer, and I really prefer to keep most of my comments about them until Church Greek. But they do govern the case of certain words, and so I'm going to mention them real briefly. There's a category of words called prepositions. Prepositions denote the relationship, either temporal or spatial or something like that, between a couple of noun ideas. In this case, you'll notice that epi is a preposition. And one of the oddities of prepositions is that they control the case of the word that comes after them. Now, the word that comes after them is called the object of the preposition. And some prepositions are followed by their object in the genitive case, some in the dative, some in the accusative. And then there are some prepositions that can have objects in 2 or even 3 cases. It gets pretty interesting, but that's why we're going to save it till later. But in this particular case, you look at logo and you go, that's a dative. You can see it with the mouse over. And here you have the omega with an iota subscript. This is why that iota subscript is so important, even though you don't say it. It is the sign of the dative singular for a lot of nouns. So in traditional Greek, you would see the omega iota subscript and know it's a dative singular. But for us, we just do the mouse over and it tells us that much. Now, as to why logos in the dative, it's because of epi. Epi is a preposition that means, well, actually, epi can mean a lot of things. But in this context, it means by. And when epi means by, it takes an object in the dative. That's why it's in the dative, okay? Go down to Mark 10:24, and you have the same thing where you have epi, but in this case, logos is dative plural. How do you make it dative plural? Well, the dative plural ending for logos is iota sigma, so you stick it onto the stem loga, and you got logos. If you go down to Mark 12:13, you have a slightly different situation. And the verse reads, "And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him." So you go to the Greek, you go hina, is in order to him, to trap, logo. Now you notice in the phrase highlighting that the word with is also highlighted. The reason is that the dative case can indicate lots of different relationships, and with is one of those relationships. So you could have put a preposition in front of it that meant with, or you can simply stick it in the dative, and contextually you're going to understand what it means. So there's an example of logo in the dative. By the way, this is a good time to emphasize something I don't think I've mentioned in the past. When you do the mouse over on logo, you can see that Dad's in my translation is statement. If you go up to 10:22, it's saying. And at 10:24, it's words. The fact of the matter is that logos has a very, very wide range of meanings. In fact, go over to the word words in Mark 10:24 and triple click. It's going to open up my dictionary. And you notice the definition is a word, a thing uttered, speech, language, talk, converse, mere talk, worldly show. What we're trying to do is to give you the full range of meanings. Now the danger is that every once in a while when you do a mouse over on a word, it's going to give you what's called a gloss. In other words, if you were learning Greek in a traditional way, you would have to memorize vocabulary, and you would go to logos, and the meanings it would give you to memorize for the vocabulary is something like word or statement, and maybe give you a couple of words like that. Those are just glosses. And all that a gloss is an approximation of what the word means. But you should never use the gloss in your word study. Always look the word up in the dictionary, because the gloss is just a bare bones basic understanding of the word, and you need to see the entry in the dictionary to get a much better feel for it. I want to show you some other examples of the dative, so we're going to do a new search. If you change the range to a mark, if you have one, change it back to New Testament. And then what we're going to do in the search box is say that we want to look for all dative nouns without a specific word. So it's bracket, noun, dative, bracket. Command-Shift-A, and then Command-Shift-R for the range, and we're going to look in Romans. You can just type the abbreviation in if you want, ROM. And I want to go to Romans 1:8. Now you can see there's two datives here, aren't there? The first one is that, first of all, I thank to theo mu. So mu is my. So it means I thank my God. Why is it a dative? Well, if you say it a different way, it'll make sense. You can say I give thanks to my God. One of the basic ideas of the dative is the idea of to. And so in order to say that, they put the word into the dative case. Go down to verse 29. And passe is not selected because we're searching for nouns, and passe is an adjective, but it's in the dative case. And look at the translations. Being filled with every kind. So passe is with all, unrighteousness, wickedness, covetousness, malice. But the idea of with is part of the understanding of the dative. And so passe is put into the dative to say they are filled with. And then our translation is every kind of. And one more. Let's go to Romans 2:14. So the Greek says, "For when Gentiles, not the law having phusei, by nature." In other words, another meaning of the dative, which we say in English with the word by. So all I have to do is put phusei in the dative, and contextually we understand it is by nature. Well, that's it for the dative, except I guess there was one quick thing I wanted to show you about searching. If you go up to search and you want to search for words and you want to find an iota subscript, you can type *A, because the iota subscripts tend to come at the end of a word. And if you don't know where the iota subscript is, remember, you go under Window, Character Palette, and you go looking for the iota subscript, and there it is, right after the final sigma. It also shows you that you can do Shift-Option-I. So close it out, type Shift-Option-I, and then do your search. You remember that by default, Accordance ignores iota subscript, so you find the first hit was Zara, no iota subscript. So if you want to tell Accordance, no, I really mean I want you to look for what I typed, just go to the beginning, enter an equal sign, do your search, and now you have your alpha with an iota subscript. And finally, let me say a few things about the genitive. The nominative, dative, and accusative are, well, they're kind of boring. There's not going to be a lot of discussion in the commentaries about them. But you are going to find discussions in the more advanced commentaries about the genitive. Now, the genitive is the basic idea of. And in fact, much of the ambiguity that we have in English with the word of is shared with the ambiguity of the genitive case. So if I said a bowl of silver, that's either a bowl made out of silver or it's a bowl that's full of silver. But we simply say a bowl of silver, and we expect the person hearing the English to look at the context, to recognize the ambiguity of the of construction, and make a decision as to which of those options I'm talking about. Well, the genitive is much like the English word of, but on steroids. In other words, there's even more flexibility in the genitive. And so what you will often find, especially, like I said, in the advanced commentaries, is quite a bit of discussion of the genitive. Now, again, I'm going to hit some of this in Church Greek, a lot of it in functional Greek. So I just want to touch on it now, but I want to show you the flexibility of the case and why translations are going to deal with the genitive in different ways. At least they often will. Go ahead and search for John 3:2. Story of Jesus and Nicodemus. And so John starts, "This man came to him nuktos." Now you notice the phrase highlighting is by night. Nuktos, the lexical form is nux, means night, but it's in the genitive. If you give a time designation and you're saying when something happens, let's say at 3 o'clock, the time designation would go in the dative. If you're giving a time designation of how long something is going to last, say for 3 days, then that time designation goes in the accusative. But when the time designation is in the genitive, it's telling you what kind of time. That's the phrase that grammars generally use. In other words, it's not so much that Nicodemus came to Jesus after the sun came down. If that were the case, nuktos would have been in the dative. It would have been nukti. But this is in the genitive. So what John is telling us is that Nicodemus came to Jesus as one who comes in the night. In other words, secretly. That's kind of cool, isn't it? Let's search for Romans 4:11. There's a couple of genitives here that are a little different, but again, we'll show you the flexibility of the language. And so Paul is writing, he received a sign, And then peritomes is in the genitive. The lexical form is peritome. It means circumcision. But if you go word for word, it's he received a sign of circumcision. Well, the problem is that the sign is circumcision. This is one of the functions of the genitive. The genitive can draw an equal sign, as it were. So what Paul is saying is that Abraham received the sign, and the sign itself is circumcision. And this, for example, will explain the language in the NIV. We translated it, and he received circumcision as a sign. In other words, the sign and the circumcision are the same thing. So the NIV is helping you with the of construction, which the NIV tends to do from time to time. You can see it in the NLT as well, can't you? Circumcision was a sign. This just gets into philosophy of translation. Some translations, for example, like the ESV, will simply say the sign of circumcision. They figure that's clear enough for someone who's studying the text and any other nuances that are present that the reader can figure out. But other translations have a slightly different philosophy, and they're going to help the reader a little more, like the NIV and especially the NLT. And so you'll see the translations interpreting the of construction for the readers. But here's a good example of why sometimes you would have to do that. Because if you just read, he received the sign of circumcision, it won't necessarily be clear to you that the sign is the circumcision. As you read down in the verse, it's the circumcision as a seal of the righteousness of faith. Well, that's an interesting expression. Righteousness of faith. What does that mean? Do a mouse over on pisteos, and you can see that it is, in fact, the genitive. And so kind of the default translation would be the righteousness of faith. And in fact, if you go over to the NASB, that's exactly what they do. The righteousness of faith. That's very typical for the NASB. But what does righteousness of faith mean in this context? Translators know that one of the functions of the genitive is to indicate the idea of by, or the idea of means. And the point that Paul is making here is that Abraham's circumcision was a sign of the righteousness that he had because of his faith. That it was a righteousness by means of his faith. It was a righteousness given to him because of his faith. Well, righteousness of faith doesn't really get that across in English, does it? So Dad and I wrote the righteousness that he had by faith. Go look at the ESV, and even the ESV, which tends not to interpret these genitive constructions unless it would lead to misunderstanding. We felt there that we needed to say by faith as well. And just to double check, if you look at the NIV, now you can see the same thing, that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. All translations have a translation philosophy. They have a certain way that they want to look at the text, and they know that other translations have their philosophies, and the philosophies are going to differ. You know, how old is the audience that you're writing to? How much biblical knowledge do you want to assume on the part of your readership? How hard do you want to make them to work to understand the meaning of the text? These are all decisions that every Bible translation committee has to make. And they make different ones for different reasons. Not because one is right and one is wrong, but because they're being written for different audiences or whatever be the case. But what's going to happen, apart from perhaps a translation like the NASB, is that when there's a phrase that just simply doesn't make sense, most translations are going to do some interpretive work. Because some people may say, just to say the righteousness of faith simply has no meaning, so it's not translation. Let's just look at a couple more and we'll be done. Let's go to 1 John 5:9. The words that we're going to focus on in Church Greek are subjective and objective genitive. Most of the discussions of the genitive in the commentaries are going to be on those 2 points. Is this a subjective genitive or an objective genitive? And without getting too far into the debate, let me illustrate it for you. So 1 John 5:9 is, if we receive the testimony of men, then switch over to the Greek, the testimony of God is greater. Well, theou is genitive. Well, what do you mean, the testimony of God? Grammarians will call theou a subjective genitive, and what they mean by that is that the word in the genitive is the subject of the action implicit in the noun it's modifying. In other words, to say it in English, God is doing, he is producing the witness. In other words, it's not a testimony about God, but it's the testimony that God himself is providing. So you switch over to the NIV, and they're making that explicit for you. But God's testimony is greater. They use the God apostrophe S construction to make the point that it is God who's doing the testimony. Go over to the NLT. Again, this is very typical for these translations. We can believe the greater testimony that comes from God. So Greek simply says of God, and a translation is either going to leave it that way, it's going to leave it ambiguous and make you work at the meaning, or depending upon its philosophy, it's going to help you understand it a little more. And by the way, all translations do this. Even the NASB and the ESV do it. All translations interpret. The rule in the ESV was that if going word for word would produce an improper understanding, if it would lead to a misunderstanding, then we tended to be a little more interpretive. Same position the NIV has, although perhaps a little more aggressively so. Let's look at an example of not a subjective genitive, but an objective genitive. Go to 1 Peter 2:19. And Peter says, "For this is commendable if, because of a conscience theou," because of the conscience of God. Well, is it God's own conscience? No. God is receiving the action of the conscience in a sense. It is the object of the conscience. It is what the conscience is about. So it's not just the conscience of God, it's, as we said it, the conscience toward God. In other words, God is the object of the verbal idea that's implicit in the noun conscience. Go over and look at some of the other translations. Go to the NIV, and it says, because they are conscious of God. So in other words, it's not God's own conscience, it's our conscience in relationship to God. Look at the ESV. When they are mindful of God, see, the choice of the word mindful over conscience makes it clear that God is the object of the action, that it's not his conscience, but it's being mindful about him. So as I said earlier on, nominatives and accusatives are pretty boring. Datives have some flexibility because there's so many ideas like by, with, in, to that can be wrapped up in the dative case, and you have to make up your mind when you're translating, although normally it's not that very difficult to see. But when you come to the genitive, there's a lot of flexibility in the genitive case. And I just wanted to give you a couple examples so that you can see the work that translators are going to help you understand the meaning of the passage. And remember, some translations are going to go much more word for word and not really care if it makes a lot of sense. On the other end of the spectrum are those that want to remove all ambiguity and want to make it really easy for you to understand the text. And in my experience, of all the translations that are out there right now, there's not really that many places where in a significant way they disagree with one another. When I started writing my textbook, Greek for the Rest of Us, I expected the translations to argue with each other, as it were, a whole lot more than they do. but rather as you compare these translations, what you're going to see is that some are more willing to sit with ambiguity and lack of clarity of meaning, and others want to help make it clear for you. For the first group, they think that translation is just getting the words across. For the other group, it's they think that translation is about getting meaning across. Now, it's a gross simplification, but you understand, I hope, where I'm getting at. Different translation philosophies, how much ambiguity are you willing to leave in the text? How hard do you want the person to work at understanding the meaning of the text? How much background, biblical background, are you assuming in the part of your readership? How old are they? And by the way, if this is interesting, be sure to pick up my Church Greek video series. I have an entire, I think it's about an hour and a half, maybe even longer, lecture on translation philosophy and why they're different. But the genitive case gives us a good example to look at this situation. Well, that's it for nouns. Just one more chapter to go.